Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Parsha is Tazria Mitzora, and, fair warning, it's about skin disease, wardrobe malfunction, and mold in your abode. If you leave, please leave quietly. But for those of you who remain, we'll peel and pick and pry and reveal what lies beneath the mold and mildew with some insights into life. So join us for Cosmetic Theology. Well, welcome back, Rabbi. We
good to be back. It's so nice.
So tonight we're not doing cosmetic surgery. We are doing cosmetic theology, and we are in Leviticus 13. And God spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "When a person has on the skin of the body a swelling, a rash, or a discoloration, and it develops into a scaly affection on the skin of the body, it shall be reported to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons, the priests." So I said scaly affection, and, we are using up-to-date modern translations. We sometimes look at translations, and tonight it's important. Everett Fox says, becomes on the skin of his body an affliction or Tzorat. He doesn't even translate it. He uses the Hebrew word Tzorat. In the Koran Jerusalem Bible, it says, "And it be in the skin of his flesh the plague of Tzorat." Again, does not really translate it. You got to go back to the 1917 Holy Scriptures, a new translation by JPS, and it gives us, "And it becomes in the skin of his flesh the plague of leprosy." So, there are very few times in the Bible, in Scripture, that translation has such a long impact. I think one of them would definitely be the horns of Moses, Karnei Re'em, that Michelangelo literally carved in stone. But certainly, if you would ask most people what our portion is about, they would say, it's about leprosy. And part of what we're going to do, and we have discussed this Parsha before, and I was scratching my head. This is the third year at least that we've discussed it. One year we talked about the beginning, which has to do with a woman giving birth. We ignored the whole leprosy part. I think last year we talked about evil language, Lashon Hara.
Right.
But tonight we are focused on Tzorat. I would have thought it'd be difficult, but at the end of the day, we've never really focused literally on what is this Tzorat. But what from the start, Rabbi? I mean, we always assume it's leprosy. Why is that?
Well, first of all, so you made a very important point, and there were actually 2 points. First point was that some of the modern translators don't bother translating it, saying that, we don't know what it means, so therefore we're not going to translate it. We'll leave it as Tzorat. Actually, the idea that it's leprosy goes back to the King James Bible, really the first English translation. They translated it as leprosy. The reason they translated it as leprosy was because we know there's an old tradition. There's a lepers hospital. If you go to Roosevelt Island, not the part of Roosevelt Island when there are apartments, but if you go to the southern part of Roosevelt Island, there's not much there, but there's a lepers hospital. Imagine someone who had leprosy in the 1800s, they sent them to Roosevelt Island to the lepers hospital. That must have been horrible because they felt that, lepers often become discolored, like the Torah says, and they were afraid of lepers, and therefore they sent them away. So part of it sounds like leprosy because they sent these people michutz lamachaneh, outside the camp. But most modern scholars say that leprosy is not a skin disease the way they describe it, that actually it's closer to psoriasis, And if you look at the modern academic translations, like Anchor Bible or things like that, you'll see that they translate it as psoriasis. So you're 100% right. The very translation is such an interesting, an interesting history.
So I'm glad you mentioned the Anchor Bible. I mean, Leviticus is a difficult book. And if you're interested in the Bible and you have a lot of your commentary sittings on your shelves, you need modern, up-to-date commentaries on Leviticus, because without them, you're kind of lost. And the Anchor Yale Bible on Leviticus is by a scholar called Jacob Milgram. And he actually is fascinated by the fact of how did it become associated with leprosy. And it's in the source sheet on Sephirah that I share with you. But the Septuagint translates it as lepra. And lepra in Greek, really, as you say, Rabbi, is psoriasis. It's a scaling disease, but it sounds like leprosy. So it truly is one of those moments, like the horns of Moses, that it just it sounded similar and it became it. And most importantly, and we're not going to focus on this verse tonight, but someone who could not get rid of this affliction would go ahead and walk around and cry out that I'm a leper, I'm a leper. And it became something, you talk about COVID, you talk about the Spanish flu. This was the original disease that stigmatized people. And when I said in the introduction that we're going to peel, we're going to scratch, we're going to look under the surface, it's because we want to get beyond this association just with a disease. And there's, in the source sheet, I found an article by, he seems to be very well read in the Bible, but he happens to be in Guinea. And he is seeing people who are exposed to the Bible through Christianity, through people that have come to expose them to the Judeo-Christian tradition. And there are so many diseases that are associated with the biblical leprosy that it truly becomes a stigma. And he says, he talks about a little bit the persistence of attitudes that stem from a written source, which in itself is kind of fascinating. But the other part is the inferred moral message or meaning that took hold in people's imagination. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about, because we have to get to the bottom of what this Tzorat is to find out what the moral message is. And one of the fascinating things that he does after he follows your route, Rabbi, of tracing the way that it became associated with leprosy through the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, and the New Testament, and the King James, he says the Jews were not led along quite the same paths. Their Bible stayed in Hebrew, and they followed the letter of its instruction. And he quotes the Talmud that talks about, number one, this is something that only affected Jews. So if it was truly a medical disease, that would make it questionable. The other thing that he raises is that if you remove the white hairs, you didn't go to the priest. I mean, one of the questions that I have, Rabbi, that I don't have an answer to is it says in our verse that, and in the whole Parsha, that if you have these affections, it says, it shall be reported to Aaron the priest or one of his sons. Really, in the Hebrew, it says, V'huva el Aharon HaKohen Ol Echad Mibanav HaKohanim. It's not exactly clear to me whether this is a law that applies to someone who has this affliction and decides to come to the Kohen, or whether you are required to go to the Kohen. I had never thought about that until this week.
That's a good question. You see, Tzorat, if you want to be very legal about it for a minute, seems like it's only a disease if the Kohen declares it a disease. Having this on you doesn't require all this. It's only once the Kohen declares it as Tzorat. And the Torah isn't clear whether or not you have to go to the Kohen. It might have been that socially everybody went to the Kohen because it was embarrassing to have this, and therefore if you had it, you had no choice but to go to the Kohen because everybody would stay away from you.
Yeah, but again, it's not altogether clear whether you have to go.
It's not clear at all, right? There's a social piece of it that you have to probably understand.
And we will get into this, but what you also touched upon, it's not altogether clear whether the Kohen heals or whether the Kohen is just an adjudicator. He's you're going to get a first opinion. Do I have it or do I not? It's not clear whether he hears. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about how broad it is. Because in Leviticus 13:47, it talks about when an eruption affection occurs in a cloth of wool or linen fabric. V'habeged kihiyebo neged tzorat. So now already we are not talking about a skin disease. We're talking about something on one's garment. And then in Leviticus 14:34, again, inside of our Parsha, it talks about if when you enter the land of Canaan that I've given you as a possession, and I inflict an eruptive plague upon a house, neged sorata babayet, in the land you possess, the owner of the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, something like a plague has appeared upon my house. And again, here too, ubo asher lo habayet vehigid lekohen. Here, for the first time, it really seems that he is he's agitated. He's told to go to the priest and tell them that he has a negah. He has this plague on his house. So now we're talking about your body, your clothing, and your home. Becomes a little broader.
Yeah, that is correct. Now, Tzorat of the home is really complicated. You see, Tzorat of the clothing is an extension of Tzorat of the skin, because you can have Tzorat on your skin, and what you have on your skin gets on your clothing. But how can your house have Tzorat, right? How can your house have Tzorat? I mean, something's wrong here.
Unless it's not a skin condition, it's not a medical condition, it's something else. So
it's a religious condition, because the rabbis say that you get it for Lashon Hara. So the minute that the rabbis say you get it for Lashon Hara, it's not a medical condition.
So what you're talking about is the cause, but even the affectation is obviously not simply a boily wound or a scaly a function. It's something that we can kind of draw a line between something that happens on the skin, in the clothing, and in the house. If you look at the Rashbam on Leviticus, he talks about manifestations of mildew or something breaking forth from the wall. It's, we all know what it's like to have mold in a house, a growth. We can even imagine, if we don't put the mothballs in our closet, that not only do moths eat it, but something with dampness can affect the clothing. But at the end of the day, if you think about mildew, you're really thinking about something that is it's not alive. It's dying. It's spoiled. It's rotten. It's off. And I think that is kind of trying to give us a hint as to what we're talking about here. And I have to go the text that we've always gone to, and you mentioned that traditionally, and I think last year we spoke about the fact that speaking evil, lashon hara, is associated strongly with this disease of Tzorat. The reason we do that is because in Numbers 12, 9 through 15, we have a story about Miriam and Aaron. And Miriam especially is saying negative things, questioning why Moses is either married to a certain type of woman or has separated from his wife, whatever. There's innuendo associated with Moses. And it says, still incensed with them, God departs. So God hears this talk where they're throwing asparaging remarks on Moses, and he leaves. As the cloud withdrew from the tent, there was Miriam stricken with snow-white scales. Mitzorat Kishelek. And this again is very clear what we're talking about. It's scaling skin. When Aaron turned toward Miriam, he saw that she was stricken with scales. And Aaron said to Moses, O Lord, account not to us the sin which we have committed in our folly. Let her not be like a stillbirth, which emerges from its mother's womb with half its flesh eaten away. Al natahi kamet asher betzeito mirechem imo. I have always focused on the part of this that talks about the evil, the innuendo, what Miriam did. But this year, I focused on the analogy. I focused on the clear association with Tzorat and a stillbirth, with Tzorat and the word mate, which is death. And, there's so much about this disease that really associates it with something that's very standard to any student of the Bible. And that is Tumah. That is impurity. And we all know that the source of impurity at the end of the day is death. And so it's like staring us right in the eyes what the association of Tzorat is. It is this association with something that is dying, something that is not alive, it's moldy, it's deteriorating. It's pretty clear. I mean, it's a fascinating association, is it not?
It is a fascinating association. Milgram talks about that because really the entire book of Vayikra is about Tumah, is about impurity. Right? Think of all the times, if you're impure, you're not allowed to give a sacrifice. If you're impure, you're not allowed to go into the temple. So actually, this fits in to a discussion about impurity.
Absolutely. And Rashi right there is, as one who is dead, he said, Aaron said this because a leper may be regarded as dead. So there is no question that we are, it's like we don't have to look very far. We simply have to figure out or fit leprosy, or Tzorat, I should say, into the standard categories that we're very accustomed to, which is anything associated with death is impure. Even the fact that in Leviticus 13, it talks about the affected person should be isolated for 7 days. Again, that's a typical type of approach to someone who has impure. It's just very, very obvious. But before we draw any obvious conclusions, I want to talk about another word that's associated with Tzorat and also is almost a symbolism for Tzorat, and that is nega. When it talks about the house, it doesn't even bother talking about nega Tzorat. It just talks about nega. And if you remember back in Genesis 12, when Abraham lied about Sarah because he was concerned that the Pharaoh of the day would kill him if he knew this beautiful woman was his wife, and he said it was my sister, and Pharaoh took this woman, and then all of a sudden, and God afflicted Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues, Nigaim Gedolim. We've come across these plagues, these conditions that are affected on people that do wrong. Even with Jacob, who fights with the angel, and in the morning the angel wrenched Jacob's hip at its sockets. Vayiga b'kaf yirecho. Different translations. All of them have touched. The word naga is to touched by God in a sense. So there's all this sense of this moral condition less than necessarily a physical condition. And the last thing I'll say before I ask you what you think is the plagues. One of the words that we use for plagues is nega. But I did a search, and in the 10 plagues that were given on Egypt, there's only one plague that it actually uses nega, and that is the last plague. In Exodus 11, and God said to Moses, I will bring but one more plague upon Pharaoh, od nega echad, and obviously that was on the firstborn. So it seems to me that what is unique about a plague that's called nega is it's on human beings. The other plagues were on locusts and frogs and animals and darkness. But when it came to touching humankind, it's called nega. And I think that again is part of the syntax that we're seeing here. It's something that is brought upon a person because he's touched by God.
That's really good. Now, but the touching by God is different here than it is there in the plagues. There he's touched because maybe not. There they're touched because they were evil. And here you're saying they're touched because they spoke Lashon Hara.
Well, they did something wrong.
They did something, and that's the point. The point is that they did something wrong.
Yeah, maybe not with Jacob fighting with the angel. That's a good example. I love that you're starting to see that we always think touched by God is a good thing, right?
Right. Well, that's what I'm suggesting. The last plague is clearly a bad.
It is, but I think we're starting to see a nuance here that being touched can be good and it can be bad. So Milgram does an amazing job of distinguishing. First of all, what he does is he says that in the ancient Near East, we have these treaties between vassals and their rulers. And they typically say, he quotes one from the vassal treaty of Esarhaddon, where at the end of it, if you don't obey me, if you don't follow my rules, you will be clothed in leprosy. You will be covered in leprosy. At the end of Hammurabi's code, we have a curse that is talking about the daughter of Anu, and it says, you will get a severe malady, a grievous illness, painful wound which cannot be healed. And Milgram says the following. He says what the Bible did was it took this affliction, and whereas with the ancient Near East in general, it was an affliction that had to do with lack of fidelity to one's ruler. And for the first time, you mentioned, and Miriam, it's a case of speaking evil. It took it into the moral code. He says that in the Bible, the attribution of scale disease for the first time is moral offenses. So we always try, when we listen to these great academics and these scholars, to number one, to benefit from understanding the context of something so that we can understand better what it means, and then ask ourselves, and how was the Torah different? And in this particular case, what Milgram is arguing is that while it was very clear it was a great curse to curse about somebody who didn't follow your rules, that they would be afflicted by a skin condition and exposed to everybody as a transgressor, what the Bible does differently, especially with Miriam, is that it makes it into something moral. And that then becomes very fascinating.
That is correct. That's a jump, what we would call a leap. That's not automatic. We wouldn't necessarily have guessed on our own. That's really your point, right? To make it moral is something that's a little surprising.
It is, and it really speaks to what we many times on Madlik do, which we look at laws as points in a process where the Torah, the Bible, the God or people is taking us from one place to another. So I think there's a sensitivity that we have to have, which of course the person who was writing about the people in Guinea, and we would have to talk about if we talk about the hospital in New York for lepers, is it's very troubling to associate a physical condition with sin, because ultimately what you're doing is you're saying that anyone who is afflicted must have done a sin. And that I don't know whether we'll have a time to get to, but certainly what the Bible is doing is moving it from something that is just one of not obeying one's ruler to something that has a moral context. We always talk about Lashon Hara, but in the Midrash Tanchuma, it associates Tzorat with cursing in God's name, with unchastity, with theft and swearing falsely, with bearing false witness, with a judge who perverts justice, for someone who instigates quarrels amongst his brother. And that to me was something that opened my mind this year, not to be pigeonholed into just this speaking evil, but to talk about these afflictions as something that is a wake-up call. And that's what I want to focus on now. The fact that the rabbis really saw these skin afflictions as an opportunity to look at oneself and to say, what about me is deteriorating? What about me is decrepit? What about me is moldy? How can I refresh myself? And I think that becomes fascinating, even to the extent that it's not the Kohen who cures you, he just diagnoses you. It's you who need to cure yourself. I was blown away. The Targum Yonatan, who is supposed to translate, and he says the Lord spoke with Moses. He took out Aaron from the pasuk that we read. I don't know why he did that.
Really? Why is that?
No one really explains why, but I would like to think that he was trying to value the Kohen HaMetaher, this sense of the Kohen was somehow doing something magical. If you read the text, it's just the Kohen who's reading the signs for you. And in the source notes, you will see so many quotations that talk about this is a sign that needs to be read. It's less of an affliction and more of an opportunity to stop and read the tea leaves. And it's almost as though you are one of the commentaries talks about the reason why this is only on Jews is not because Jews are better, but because this is a gift. It's a gift to be able to get an affliction, a barrier, a challenge, and to use it as a way to reevaluate, refresh, revitalize your life. I think that's really part of it. We're running out of time. The fascinating thing is, at the end, when you are finally considered pure, you have to bring a chatat, which is a sacrifice for someone who's done a sin, which makes a lot of sense, except the Parsha begins with a woman giving birth, and she has to give a sin offering. And I think there are commentaries who say, what's the connection? And I really do think that at the end of the day, it's all about rebirth. And we've just come out of Passover, and we're in the spring. It seems to me that the rabbinical interpretation, in any case, of this Tzorat is almost as though it's a welcome sign. It's an opportunity to wake oneself up from lethargy and to give birth, in a sense.
I love it. And we can just close with this idea. I love the fact that the chatat is the transition. Usually we think of a chatat as a sin offering, but you're giving it a little bit of a twist. It's not a sin offering. What it is it's a new start. It gives you a chance to put all that from prior behind you, and you can start anew. And that needs a symbol, and that's the korban chatat. That's really good. I think this was really interesting. And, you started, Geoffrey, by saying that we've kind of shied away from leprosy. But I think tonight we really did a good job, trying to figure out what first of all, what the definition of the term is, and then to transition into the moral aspect, which I think is an important issue, not only in the rabbinic sense of Lashon Hara, but in the Torah itself, understanding the moral sense of Nega and the moral sense of Tzorat. So Shabbat Shalom, Geoffrey. Shabbat Shalom to everybody who joined us. Welcome back. It's nice to be back, and we're looking forward to a great spring and summer season together. So Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, and I will only say on a personal note, this is extremely special Shabbat for me because my grandson Adam is becoming a bar mitzvah. If you're in New York City and you can come to Lincoln Square Synagogue, I have a feeling he will be talking about the woman giving birth and really picking up where we left off tonight. But it is very exciting for me. It's a very special Shabbat of rebirth. What is a grandchild if not rebirth? And I wish you all, and those of you who want to continue the discussion, I see Yonatan, you're on the beam. Anyone else? Let's keep talking. But Shabbat Shalom to all of you.
And Mazal Tov to Geoffrey and to the Stern family. We're really excited.
Yonatan.
Yes,
Yochanan. So you had tell us something about Tzorat?
Yes, so I think some commentators say that it has to do with hygiene. But I was reading a commentator from the 19th century, Tofrei Nun, what makes 1890. He was a grandson and a disciple of the Malbim, who died 10 years earlier. And he says it's all about hygiene.
We kind of touched upon this. We did a podcast a few weeks ago called Wash Your Hands. And we talked about those people, I would call it almost a Bubba Meiser, but that doesn't give it enough kavod, who said that the Jews survived the Black Plague because they washed more often. And again, I'm not sure if this is something that originated with us, because certainly Jews were killed for this aspersion that somehow they were not getting the Black Plague. The Black Plague was not good for the Jews, both on a medical level as well as an excuse to engage in anti-Semitism. But the commentaries that I read, Yochanan, all focus on the fact that it cannot be considered something that just is based on teva, on nature. There were some of them who argue that it only applies in the land of Israel. When it comes to the nega Tzorat on your house, that clearly says in our parsha, when you come into the land. Some of them extrapolate from that all of it has to do with being in the land, which leads one to believe that it's a gift for an elevated level of spirituality, and that it actually is not simply something that has to do with germs and getting a disease. But there's a rich history of associating it with literally with a disease, and understandably so.
So what do you think about the Black Plague? Why did Jews suffer less of the Black Plague?
First of all, it's not clear that that's the case. The data the data is 50% Jews saying that we weren't affected as much by the Black Plague, as much as non-Jews claiming that the Jews were not affected by the Black Plague and were to blame. It's kind of like 9/11, that those who claimed that the Jews knew about it and didn't show up that day. It was definitely an excuse for anti-Semitism. I think if you look at the Sephira notes for that episode, it's not altogether clear that in fact Jews were less affected by it. But again, it's good to wash your hands. It's good for hygiene. I think that most Jews would argue that there's a ritual aspect about washing one's hands. And clearly what I was arguing tonight is that if we remove the association with leprosy, the skin disease, and we look at it starting with Miriam, but throughout, it's probably something else. But again, it's all there. There are no right answers tonight. Lauren, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Geoffrey. Congratulations on the upcoming bar mitzvah. This is a very difficult parsha, a couple of parshas to read, because if you read it literally, at least in my opinion, you're going to come away from it with possibly an understanding of maybe almost post-rabbinic interpretation that it was a disease. I'm not sure that the early rabbis would have considered that to be the case, but I think you've really struck on an important part of it after you get through this extensive outline that you've provided to us. That it sets forth moral standards that you should not violate. And I think that if you're looking at it, reading it to today, it's more of how are we going to be better people, and how are we going to make our lives and the lives of those that we interact with better also. I think it's a much more moral message than a specific message on whether or not it only applies to people in Israel, or it's more than just a symbolic appearance, condition, or whether it's cured in 7 days. I mean, there's so many things within this text that could make it very, very specific to violation, but there's also so much in it that says, if you're reading it today, that it gives us an opportunity, because your sheet has given us outlines of things that you shouldn't probably do. And if we follow those things, in my opinion, we get away from being overly concerned about violation and more concerned about trying to change our lives.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the elephant in the room is when bad things happen to good people. that you can take this these chapters as a license to say when somebody is afflicted with something, they deserve it, and that, I think, is a message that none of us can accept, and if that was the message of the text, then I would argue, listen, you made a quantum leap when you took these physical ailments away from the ancient Near East as punishments for not listening to a ruler, and you made them into moral. And we're going to take the same quantum leap and say that they are also not in any way do they espouse the concept that when bad things happen to good people, they must be to blame. But I would like to think that that's not the interpretation. And I would like to think, if you read between the notes, I wasn't quite sure whether you had to go to the priest or you could go to the priest. This is something where somebody is reading a sign in their body, and they're saying, this is an opportunity for me to reevaluate myself to get to a higher level. I didn't quote the Sforno on Leviticus, but he has words in there that says, this concern by God not to let man waste his opportunity to live up to his destiny. He will begin to realize that by listening to the urgings of his body-dominated desires, he risks... The idea is that there are commentaries who see this as a metaphor for people listening, for people reading the tea leaves, for people waking up and smelling the coffee and saying, what about my life? Can I change? And by their own volition, they go to the priest. The priest does not heal them. He simply is there as as someone to talk to, an arbiter. So that, again, I might be pushing the envelope, but that's the message that I take. And of course, the overwhelming message is that we're putting this into the paradigm, which is a very strong paradigm in the Bible, of life and death. Life is good. Death is bad. Deterioration, degradation, mold, and becoming fixed and stagnant is bad. Life and progress and vitality is good. So, and at the end, it ties to the beginning of the Parsha, which has to do with birth and, in a sense, rebirth. So that's the way I take it. But I feel very strongly that it fits within the paradigm of Tumah and Taharah, which at the end of the day has to do with something that increases life or something that increases status and death. So that
I was listening to a interpretation of it recently about, and the association with Tikkun Olam is that's what you take away from this. This is, you're pointing yourself to a different direction, and the specifics and the imagery that's contained within a very historical text that's what it's meaning today. So I don't know. I feel fairly strongly about that. I think that it gives us an opportunity to reevaluate, which is what I guess this study is all about.
Shabbat Shalom to everybody.